The girl in the shadows. The ruins were silent, except for the sound of Ethan Carter's boots crunching against the broken ground. The city had been dead for a long time. Massive buildings, once proud and tall, now lay in pieces. Strange alien symbols covered the walls, half erased by time and war. Ethan moved carefully, his eyes scanning the area. He was alone, but he knew better than to trust silence. He had been a scavenger for years, searching abandoned worlds for anything valuable. Fuel, weapons, food. But this place felt different. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt haunted. As he stepped into a dark alley, his hand tightened around his blaster. The air was cold, unnaturally so. He looked around. Something was wrong. Then he felt it, a presence in the shadows. A pair of glowing red eyes watched him from the darkness. Ethan's pulse quickened. He lifted his blaster, ready to fire. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. He took a cautious step forward. The glow of his wrist light cut through the darkness, revealing a figure chained to the wall. It was a girl, but not human. Her skin was deathly pale, almost white, and her long black hair was tangled and dirty. Her arms and legs were wrapped in thick metal chains, locking her in place. Her clothes were torn, barely covering her thin body. But it was her eyes that unsettled him the most. Bright, glowing red, filled with something dangerous and desperate. Ethan hesitated. She looked weak, barely alive. But he knew what she was. He had heard the stories. A vampire. Not the kind from Earth's legends, but the kind that feeds on life energy, drains their victims dry, and leaves nothing but empty husks. A race feared across the galaxy. And yet, this one had been left here, chained up like a prisoner. Ethan's instinct told him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. He had survived this long by not getting involved. But then the girl spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Help. Me." Ethan froze. Her voice wasn't like a monster's. It wasn't cold or cruel. It was weak, broken, pleading. He took a slow step forward. "Who did this to you?" She tried to lift her head but was too weak. "My own kind." That surprised him. Why would her own people do this to her? Weren't vampires supposed to be ruthless warriors? Why would they abandon one of their own? Ethan sighed. This was trouble. Big trouble. But something inside him refused to walk away. He knelt down and inspected the chains. They weren't just ordinary restraints. They were energy suppression chains, designed to block her powers. Someone had wanted her to suffer, to die slowly. She was trembling now, struggling to stay conscious. Ethan made his decision. He couldn't leave her here. He pulled out his plasma cutter and started working on the chains. The girl flinched as if expecting pain, but he wasn't here to hurt her. The metal sizzled as he cut through the first restraint. Then something shifted in the air. A whisper, a movement in the distance. Ethan's body tensed. They weren't alone. His instincts screamed danger. He turned his head, scanning the shadows. And then he saw them, dark figures moving between the ruins. Watching, waiting. Whoever had left her here was coming back. Ethan worked faster. The second chain snapped. Then the third. The girl gasped as if she could breathe again. But she was still too weak to stand. "Can you walk?" he asked, glancing at the approaching figures. She shook her head weakly. Damn it. Ethan had no choice. He picked her up, carrying her over his shoulder. Her body was ice cold, but she didn't resist. As he turned to leave, a deep voice echoed through the ruins. "You should not have done that, human." Ethan spun around. A group of heavily armed alien warriors stepped forward, their weapons glowing in the dark. Their leader, a tall figure in black armor, smiled coldly. His eyes, just like the girl's, were bright red, but filled with cruelty. "She was left here for a reason," the warrior said. "And now you will suffer with her." Ethan gritted his teeth. So this was a trap. The girl shivered in his arms. "They will kill you," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her, then at the enemies blocking his way. He smiled slightly. They can try. The hunter and the prey. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. Ethan Carter tightened his grip on the alien girl in his arms, his muscles tensed. The vampire warriors surrounded him, their glowing red eyes filled with amusement. They were confident, too confident. Ethan knew why. They thought he was just a weak human, an easy kill. Big mistake. The leader, a towering figure with dark armor and sharp fangs, stepped forward. "You do not understand, human," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "That girl is a traitor. She is cursed. She is not worth your life." Ethan's gaze flickered to the girl in his arms. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. If she was dangerous, why hadn't she attacked him yet? If she was cursed, why did she look so fragile? He had no time to figure it out. He pulled his blaster and fired. A bright pulse of plasma shot through the air, hitting the leader square in the chest. The alien stumbled back, surprised, but not dead. His armor absorbed most of the damage. The others reacted instantly. They charged. Ethan ran. He didn't have time for a fight. Not while carrying a half-dead girl. He sprinted through the ruins, weaving between broken walls and shattered buildings. Plasma blasts exploded behind him, sending up clouds of dust and fire. The girl stirred in his arms, her fingers twitching. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you save me?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know why himself. Instinct, pity, or maybe something else. Something that told him leaving her behind was wrong. A blast nearly took his head off. He ducked, rolling behind a broken wall. The enemy was fast. Too fast. They were closing in. I can't outrun them. His ship was still far away, hidden in an underground bunker. He needed another way out. His eyes scanned the area. Then he saw it, an old transport pod, half buried in rubble. It was alien tech, but he had learned how to work with these things over the years. It was his only chance. He bolted toward it, the girl's weight slowing him down. The warriors were getting closer, their growls echoing through the ruins. 10 meters. A plasma blast grazed his arm, burning through his jacket. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward. 5 meters. One of the warriors leaped, claws outstretched, ready to rip him apart. Ethan twisted at the last second, kicking the alien in the chest. The warrior slammed into the rubble, snarling in frustration. 1 meter. Ethan jumped inside the pod, slamming his hand against the controls. The engine whined to life, shaking off years of dust. He punched in commands, praying the system still worked. The screen flashed. Power at 23%. Limited flight mode activated. "Good enough," he muttered. The warriors reached the pod just as it launched into the sky, flames roaring beneath it. Ethan felt his stomach lurch as they shot upward, escaping into the clouds. The warriors howled in rage below, watching their prey slip away. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. They would come for him. They would never stop hunting her. The silent passenger. The transport pod was small, barely big enough for 2 people. Ethan set the girl down gently, pressing a button to seal the door. She was still weak, but she looked at him with those strange, glowing red eyes. He could feel her hunger, her exhaustion. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. She hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "Nyx." It was the first time she had spoken her name. Ethan sighed, leaning back against the cold metal wall. "All right, Nyx. You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" She looked away, staring at her hands. "I am not like them." "Yeah, I figured that much." She swallowed. "My kind. The Bloodlords, they believe in strength. They feed on the weak. They kill without mercy. But I refused." Ethan studied her. She was still young, barely past what a human would call her teenage years. But there was something else in her eyes. Something ancient. "They called me a failure," she whispered. "A disgrace to our species. They left me to die. And now, they will hunt me until I am dead." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Great, so I just pissed off an entire army of vampire warlords." Nix managed a weak, bitter smile. "Yes." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Fantastic." The ship's computer beeped, snapping him back to reality. A red warning flashed across the screen. "Tracking signal detected." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Damn it. The pod was compromised. The Bloodlords had planted a tracker on his ship. That meant they were already on their way. He turned to Nix. "Can you fight?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If I feed, I can regain my strength." Ethan tensed. He knew what that meant. She needed blood. She saw his expression and quickly added, "I don't have to kill. I can take only a little, just enough to survive." Ethan clenched his jaw. He hated this. Every part of his instinct told him not to trust her. But he had no choice. She wasn't the only one being hunted anymore. Escape from the Bloodlords. The pod's warning sirens screamed through the small cockpit. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls, trying to shake the incoming Bloodlord warship. The display screen showed a red dot. Their hunters were close. Too close. Nix sat beside him, her pale fingers gripping the seat's edges. Though still weak, her glowing red eyes scanned the screen with eerie focus. "They found us faster than I expected," she murmured. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Yeah, well, they really don't like you." Nix didn't respond. She knew it was true. The Bloodlords wouldn't stop until she was dead. Or worse. The warship arrives. A deep rumble shook the pod. The enemy ship had arrived. Through the cockpit window, Ethan saw it. A massive obsidian black warship emerging from hyperspace. The ship was shaped like a predatory bird, its long, curved wings casting a shadow over the stars. Blood-red insignias covered the hull, marking it as belonging to the High Order of the Bloodlords. Nix's body tensed. That's not just a hunting vessel. That's a war cruiser. Ethan didn't need a second opinion. He could tell by the sheer size of it. They were dealing with an elite ship, one meant to crush resistance and wipe out entire cities. He let out a slow breath. "Great. We're totally screwed." A booming voice echoed over the pod speakers. "Fugitive Nix of the Crimson Bloodline, you are hereby sentenced to death for your crimes." Nix's face darkened. Ethan frowned. "No trial. No need," Nix muttered. "To them, I'm already dead." The warship fired. The chase begins. A massive plasma bolt streaked toward them, bright as a dying sun. Ethan pulled the controls hard to the left. The pod veered, just barely dodging the blast. A shockwave followed, shaking the tiny ship like a leaf in a storm. Nix grabbed onto the seat, her breathing sharp. "They won't stop," she said. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Yeah, no kidding." Another barrage of plasma bolts rained down. Ethan dodged, rolling the ship through the debris field of a long-forgotten battle. Wreckage drifted through space, jagged metal floating like shattered bones. The warship kept coming. Ethan's mind raced. The pod's shields were weak, its weapons non-existent. If they tried to fight, they were dead. If they tried to run, they were still dead. The warship had a faster drive. Nix studied the enemy ship carefully. Then, suddenly, she whispered, "Get us close." Ethan nearly laughed. "Excuse me? That thing is trying to kill us." "I know," she said, "but if we get close enough, I can get inside." Ethan shot her a glance. "You want to board their ship?" Nix met his gaze, eyes burning red with determination. "It's the only way." Ethan exhaled sharply. He didn't like this. Not one bit. But he had no choice. The infiltration plan. Ethan pushed the engines to max, the pod shooting forward like a bullet. The warship's plasma cannons adjusted, locking onto them again. Nix closed her eyes, concentrating, her breathing steadied, her fingers twitching. I'll only get one chance, she whispered. Ethan stole a quick glance at her. You sure about this? I have to be. She reached out and touched his wrist, just for a second. Ethan felt something shift, a strange warmth spreading through him, a pulse of alien energy. His vision blurred for an instant, like the universe itself had tilted. Then Nyx let go. Ethan's breath came faster. What the hell was that? A connection, she said simply. It'll keep me linked to you. Ethan didn't have time to ask more. The warship grew larger in front of them. Hold on, he muttered. The pod swerved and spun, slipping through the gaps in the warship's shields. The enemy cannons hesitated. They didn't want to fire on their own ship. That was their mistake. Ethan slammed a button. The emergency hatch blasted open. And in one fluid motion, Nyx leaped into space. For a terrifying second, she was nothing but a dark silhouette against the void. Then she landed on the warship's hull, claws extending from her fingertips, latching onto the metal surface. Ethan immediately peeled away, drawing the enemy's attention. All right, Nyx, do your thing. No answer. She was already gone. Nyx's mission. Inside the warship, Nyx moved like a shadow. She slipped through the corridors, silent as death. The Bloodlord warriors patrolled in heavy armor, their weapons gleaming in the dim red lighting. Nyx knew their patterns. She knew how they hunted. And she knew how to avoid them. She had one goal: disable the warship's engines. She slid into a ventilation shaft, crawling through the narrow space. Below her, two guards spoke in hushed tones. Why do we even care about this traitor? One muttered. She is an embarrassment to our kind, the other sneered. She refuses to feed. She refuses to kill. She must be erased. Nyx's jaw tightened. She pushed forward, reaching the main power core. The pulsating red energy lit up the chamber, cables humming with raw power. She had to overload it. Her fingers danced over the control panel, entering override commands. The system resisted at first, but she knew the codes. She was one of them. Once. Alarms blared. She had less than a minute. The great escape. Ethan saw it happen. The warship's lights flickered. The engines faltered. Then, an explosion. Nyx's sabotage had worked. Ethan swooped in with the pod, catching her just in time as she jumped from the warship. She crashed into the seat beside him, breathing heavily, her face pale. You okay? Ethan asked. She gave a weak smile. I got us a head start. Ethan laughed dryly. You blew up their engines. Nyx shrugged. They'll live. The warship faded behind them, left stranded in the void. For now, they were free. But not for long. The calm before the storm. The ship was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the engines and Ethan's fingers tapping against the console. He stared at the scanner screen, watching the red dots, enemy ships, gathering in the distance. They're regrouping, he muttered. Nyx sat in the co-pilot's seat, her expression unreadable. She was still weak from the sabotage mission, but her glowing red eyes remained sharp. They won't make the same mistake twice, she said. Ethan exhaled. Fantastic. They had escaped one warship, but now an entire fleet was coming. If they got caught again, there would be no mercy this time. Nyx shifted uncomfortably. She was still recovering from her injuries, but Ethan could tell something else was bothering her. They didn't just send hunters, she said. They sent the highborn. Ethan frowned. The highborn. She nodded. The elites of my kind. They are more powerful than normal bloodlords. Faster. Stronger. They don't just hunt. They erase. Ethan tightened his jaw. That's comforting. Nyx turned her gaze to the window, looking at the endless void of space. We have to disappear, she said. Ethan drummed his fingers on the controls. That's easier said than done. The ship's fuel was low, and their damage from the last battle was severe. If they didn't find a place to land soon, they'd be sitting ducks. Nyx seemed to sense his thoughts. I know a place, she said hesitantly. Ethan turned to her. Where? She hesitated. It's not safe, but it's the only place they won't follow. Ethan arched an eyebrow. And why is that? Nyx met his gaze, her red eyes dark and serious. Because it's where the dead go. Entering the graveyard, the ship dropped out of hyperspace, and immediately Ethan understood what she meant. Before them stretched an endless field of wreckage, ships, broken and abandoned, floating lifelessly in the void. It was a starship graveyard. Massive battleships, long forgotten, lay shattered among the debris. Some were thousands of years old, their hulls covered in ice from drifting in deep space for centuries. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had heard of places like this. Fields of war, where battles had been fought long ago, and where the dead still lingered. Nyx's voice was quiet. No one comes here. The energy fields around this place. They drain life. Ethan shivered. Even through the ship, he felt something wrong about this place. Great, he muttered. A haunted battlefield. Exactly where I wanted to be today. Nyx managed a faint smirk, but it quickly faded. They won't follow us in, she said. But if we stay too long, we won't leave either. Ethan glanced at the scanners. The Bloodlord fleet had stopped chasing. They were lingering at the edge of the graveyard, refusing to come closer. Ethan let out a breath of relief. Well, at least that part worked. But Nyx wasn't looking at the fleet. She was staring into the graveyard. There's something here, she whispered. Ethan followed her gaze, and then the ship's lights flickered. The ghosts of the past. Ethan's heart pounded. Did something just hit us? Nyx didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the window. Ethan looked out into the wreckage. And then, something moved. At first, he thought it was just floating debris. But then he saw it clearly. A shadow. A figure. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A massive creature, dark as the void itself, drifted between the broken ships. Its form shifted, flickering, like it wasn't completely in this reality. Long arms, hollow eyes, a shape that twisted and changed. Nyx's voice was barely a whisper. The Wraithborn. Ethan swallowed. You want to explain that? Nyx's hands clenched into fists. They are the ones who remained, warriors who died in this battle long ago. But something kept them here. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls. And they're real? Nyx nodded. Oh, they're real. And then, the ship's power cut out. The silent attack. Darkness. For a terrifying moment, the ship was dead. No lights. No engines. Just silence. Then the emergency systems flickered back on. Ethan swore under his breath. Okay, not a fan of that. Nyx was still staring out the window. They're coming, she whispered. Ethan's fingers tightened around his blaster. Coming how? Nyx didn't need to answer. Because the first shadowy figure appeared inside the ship. It rose from the floor, its form flickering like static, half in this world, half somewhere else. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan. Ethan fired. The plasma bolt passed right through it. The wraith didn't even flinch. Ethan's stomach turned. That's not fair. Nyx grabbed his wrist. Run. The ship shook violently, more wraiths appearing from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Ethan and Nyx bolted toward the cockpit. I thought this place was safe, Ethan shouted. It's safe for my kind, Nyx yelled back. Not from them. Ethan jumped into the pilot's seat, trying desperately to restart the engines. But the ship wasn't responding. The wraiths were draining the power. Come on, come on, come on, Ethan muttered. Nyx pressed her hands to the controls. Let me try. Ethan's eyes widened as her energy surged through the ship. The console screens flared to life. Ethan grabbed the controls. All right, let's get the hell out of here. The engines roared, blasting the ship forward. But as they escaped the graveyard, one of the wraiths latched onto the hull. Nyx's eyes widened. It's coming with us. Ethan gritted his teeth. Fantastic. The shadow that followed. The alarms inside the ship screamed, flashing red warning signals across the control panels. Ethan's fingers clenched the controls as he pushed the ship's engines to their limits. They had barely escaped the Wraithborn in the graveyard of dead ships, but one had latched onto their hull before they got away. And now, something unnatural was inside the ship. Ethan glanced at Nyx, who was staring at the scanner with a deep frown. Her pale hands trembled slightly as she tapped the screen. "It's still here," she whispered. Ethan felt his stomach twist. "Where?" Nyx turned her head toward the darkened corridor leading to the back of the ship. "There." The moment she said it, the lights flickered. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy, like something was draining the life out of the room. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not words, not a voice, just a sound. A low, eerie hum that crawled through the ship like a ghost in the walls. Nyx's breath hitched. "It's hunting us." Ethan's fingers instinctively wrapped around his blaster. "Yeah. Well, it's not the only one." The arrival of the Highborn. Just as Ethan said it, the ship's long-range scanners blared a second warning. New ships had arrived. Not just any ships. The Highborn. Ethan cursed and slammed a fist against the controls. The Bloodlords weren't just sending their normal hunters anymore. They had sent their best. Nyx's jaw tightened. "I told you they wouldn't stop." Ethan exhaled. "How bad are we talking?" Nyx didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned her red eyes toward the display, watching the incoming fleet. 4 warships, heavily armored. And at the center of them, a massive obsidian black dreadnought, larger than anything Ethan had ever seen. She swallowed hard. "That ship in the middle. It belongs to Lord Vakar." Ethan's fingers froze over the controls. "Should I know who that is?" Nyx's expression darkened. "He's the one who left me to die." Ethan stared at her. Before he could respond, a deep booming voice filled the ship's communication channel. "Nyx of the Crimson Bloodline." The voice was smooth, commanding, but filled with undeniable cruelty. "You have run far enough. Your existence ends today." Ethan rolled his eyes and flicked a switch. "Oh great, another bad guy monologue." Nyx didn't laugh. She was staring at the screen, her eyes locked onto the warship. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. Fighting 2 battles at once. Ethan spun the ship in a sharp turn, avoiding the first wave of enemy fire. The Highborn warships began their attack, plasma bolts raining down like a meteor storm. "Shields at 30%. Ethan shouted. Nyx's hands tightened into fists. "I can take them down." Ethan gave her a skeptical glance. "You're still weak." "I can fight," she said firmly. Before Ethan could argue, a new horrifying sound echoed from the back of the ship. The Wraithborn. The whispering had turned into a low, unearthly growl. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were already outgunned, and now they had something else hunting them from inside their own ship. "Fantastic," Ethan muttered. 2 fights at once. This just keeps getting better. Nyx turned to him. "You fly. I'll handle the Wraithborn." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure?" Nyx's eyes burned red. "I was left to die once. Never again." Ethan gave her a small nod. Then he turned back to the controls and muttered, "All right. Let's see if I can piss these guys off enough to make mistakes." Nyx disappeared into the shadows, heading toward the back of the ship. Nyx versus the Wraithborn. The corridor was pitch black. The lights had fully died, leaving nothing but cold air and silence. Nyx moved carefully, her steps slow, precise. Then she heard it, a low, distorted growl. She turned her head just as the Wraithborn emerged from the darkness. Its body was twisted, flickering, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it slithered toward her. Hollow eyes burned into hers, filled with endless hunger. Nyx clenched her fists. She refused to show fear. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady. The Wraithborn lunged. Nyx dodged, moving faster than human eyes could follow. She spun around, her claws extending, slashing through the creature's form. It let out an inhuman shriek. Nyx didn't stop. She focused her power, her energy surging through her hands. If it was draining their life force, she had to do the opposite. She had to burn it away. With a cry, she unleashed a pulse of crimson energy, and for the first time, the Wraithborn screamed in pain. Its body convulsed, twisting violently, then shattered into nothing but shadow. Nyx stood there, breathing heavily. It was gone. But the real battle was still ahead. Ethan versus the Highborn. Back in the cockpit, Ethan was doing everything he could not to die. The Highborn ships were relentless, but Ethan had one advantage. He wasn't fighting fair. He dipped the ship into the debris field of the graveyard, weaving between the floating wreckage. Plasma bolts slammed into the ruined ships instead of him. But the dreadnought was still gaining. A new message came through. You cannot run, human. It was Lord Vakar. Ethan smirked. Wanna bet? Then he cut the engines. For a single terrifying second, the ship went completely still. The Highborn warships raced forward, expecting him to keep moving. They were wrong. Ethan reactivated the engines at full power, spinning the ship around in an instant, and fired everything he had. Torpedoes, plasma cannons, all of it. The lead Highborn ship exploded instantly. Ethan let out a sharp breath. That's one down. But before he could celebrate, a massive force slammed into his ship. The dreadnought had locked onto them. A deep laughter filled the speakers. Now you die. Ethan's eyes darted to Nyx as she ran into the cockpit. She looked at him. We have one chance. Ethan smirked. Then let's take it. A leap into the unknown. The ship lurched forward, propelled by an unnatural force. The stars outside stretched and twisted, reality itself bending as Nyx poured every ounce of her energy into the ship's systems. Ethan gritted his teeth. What the hell are you doing? Nyx's eyes burned with crimson light as she gripped the controls, her breath shallow. Something they won't expect. A sudden explosion of light engulfed the cockpit. For a split second, everything turned white, then black. Silence. When Ethan opened his eyes, the ship was floating in total darkness. No stars, no planets, nothing. The sensors blinked offline. The ship's engines flickered, struggling to stay active. Ethan's fingers tapped against the control panel. Okay, what just happened? Nyx was breathing heavily, her body trembling from exhaustion. I used a blood rift. Ethan blinked. A what? Nyx's voice was weak. A secret technique, used only by the Highborn. It lets us move through space in a way humans can't. But Ethan stared at her. But Nyx's red eyes slowly lifted to meet his. I have no idea where we are. The forgotten world. Ethan clenched his jaw and flicked a switch, forcing the ship's scanners to reboot. The screen flickered back to life, scanning their surroundings. A single massive structure appeared on the display. A planet. No, not just a planet. A dying world. The surface was cracked and broken, glowing rivers of molten rock cutting through its landmasses. Massive ruins stretched across its wastelands, cities once filled with life, now nothing but skeletons of their former selves. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Where are we? Nyx hesitated before whispering. The lost world of Kalos. Ethan frowned. Never heard of it. You wouldn't have, Nyx said. It was erased from history. Ethan's grip on the controls tightened. And why exactly would someone erase an entire planet? Nyx hesitated, then said, because this is where the Bloodlords were created. Ethan stared at her. You're telling me this is your home world? Nyx shook her head. No, this is where the first Bloodlords were made, and where they were betrayed. The betrayal of the Bloodlords. As they descended toward the ruined planet, Nyx's voice was quiet. Thousands of years ago, the Bloodlords weren't like they are now. They weren't monsters. Ethan listened as she continued. They were once a proud civilization, gifted with the ability to absorb energy from living things. But they didn't take life carelessly. They lived in balance. She exhaled. Until they were betrayed. Ethan frowned. By who? Nyx's voice darkened. By the Highborn. She turned to him, her red eyes filled with something deep, something painful. The Highborn were once just a faction within our people, but they wanted more. They wanted power beyond limits. So they did something unthinkable. Ethan's fingers clenched around the controls. What did they do? Nyx's voice dropped to a whisper. They sacrificed our entire civilization. Ethan's chest tightened. Nyx continued. The Highborn made a deal with an ancient force, something older than time itself. In exchange for immortality, strength, and endless hunger, they offered our entire race as a blood sacrifice. Ethan's stomach turned. They didn't just kill us, Nyx whispered. They changed us. They turned us into the blood lords you know today, warriors cursed to hunger forever. Ethan exhaled slowly. And this place. Nyx looked at the ruins below. This is the graveyard of those who resisted. Entering the ruins, the ship landed on a cracked ancient platform near a towering structure, what looked like an abandoned temple, its walls covered in glowing alien symbols. Ethan grabbed his blaster and stood. All right. We came here by accident, but I'm guessing you have a reason to go inside. Nyx slowly nodded. There's something here, something the Highborn don't want me to find. Ethan sighed. Of course there is. The two stepped outside, the heat of the planet hitting them instantly. The sky above was red and swirling, storms raging in the distance. The air smelled of ash and old blood. As they approached the temple, Nyx suddenly stopped. Her entire body tensed. Ethan frowned. What's wrong? Nyx's voice was barely audible. Someone is already here. Lord Vakar's arrival. The moment she said it, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows of the temple entrance. Ethan immediately raised his blaster, but Nyx's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. No, she whispered. That won't work. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Who is that? The figure stepped forward. Tall, powerful, wrapped in black armor with glowing red veins pulsing through it. His face was sharp, his fangs long, his red eyes burning with pure malice. Nyx's voice was filled with hate. Lord Vakar. Ethan's grip on his blaster tightened. The guy who left you to die. Vakar smirked. Ah, little Nyx, still running. I see. Nyx's fists clenched, but she remained still. Ethan took a step forward. So you're the guy leading this whole hunt. Vakar's red eyes flickered to him, as if only now acknowledging his existence. He tilted his head. And you must be the human who thinks he can save her. Ethan returned the smirk. Not thinking. Doing. Vakar let out a slow, amused chuckle. Fascinating. Then, in an instant, he vanished. Ethan barely had time to react before a force slammed into him, sending him flying into the temple wall. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the stone. His vision blurred. Nyx screamed his name. Ethan barely had time to lift his head before Vakar appeared above him, pressing a clawed hand against his throat. You do not belong here, human. Ethan struggled, but Vakar's strength was inhuman. Nyx's voice rang out, filled with anger. Let him go. Vakar didn't look at her, or what? Nyx's red eyes flared with power, and then, in a voice that shook the air itself, she whispered, Or I'll show you what happens when the hunted fights back. The moment before battle. The temple's air was thick with tension. The ground beneath Ethan's back was cold stone, cracked from age and covered in ancient alien carvings. Lord Vakar's hand was still around his throat, fingers pressing down just enough to remind him who was in control. Nyx stood a few feet away, her crimson eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Her breath was slow, controlled, but Ethan could see the rage in her stance, the way her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms. Let him go. Vakar's lips curled into a smirk, his fangs flashing under the blood-red sky. Still so protective of your pet, Nyx. Ethan coughed, forcing words past the crushing grip on his throat. Hey, buddy. If I'm a pet, at least I'm a stray. You're a trained lapdog. Vakar's amusement vanished. A powerful force slammed into Ethan's chest, lifting him off the ground and throwing him across the temple floor. He crashed into a stone pillar, pain lancing through his ribs. Nyx moved instantly. She vanished in a blur of speed, reappearing next to Vakar, with her claws slashing toward his throat. But Vakar was faster. He caught her wrist mid-strike and twisted, slamming her into the ground so hard the stone cracked beneath her. Ethan groaned, forcing himself back onto his feet. His head was spinning, ribs screaming in pain, but he refused to stay down. Vakar stepped back, admiring his own strength. You're pathetic, Nyx. You always were. A failure. An embarrassment to our kind. Nyx struggled to push herself up, blood trickling from her lip, but she was smiling. Funny, she rasped. I was just thinking the same thing about you. Vakar's expression darkened. Then, he attacked. The final battle. The moment Vakar moved, everything became chaos. Nyx dodged to the side, barely avoiding a strike that shattered the stone where she had been standing. She countered with a precise kick to his ribs, but he caught her leg and spun her midair, throwing her straight toward Ethan. Ethan had no time to think. He caught her, stumbling back from the impact. Vakar didn't let up. He was already in front of them, moving faster than a human eye could track. Ethan reacted on instinct. He raised his blaster and fired point-blank. The plasma bolt hit Vakar in the chest, and did absolutely nothing. Vakar sneered. Pathetic. Ethan gritted his teeth. Yeah, I get that a lot. Nyx lunged forward again, this time channeling pure crimson energy through her fists. She aimed directly for Vakar's heart. He blocked, but this time, he winced. For the first time, she had hurt him. Nyx saw it. Ethan saw it, and Vakar knew they had seen it. Nyx's lips curled. Oh, so you can bleed. Vakar growled, his crimson eyes burning brighter. This ends now. The dark truth revealed. Vakar lifted his hands, pulling energy from the ruins around them. The entire temple shook, ancient symbols glowing with dark power. Nyx's eyes widened. He's using the Highborn's blood magic. Ethan steadied his stance. I assume that's bad. Nyx nodded. Very bad. The air rippled as Vakar's power spread. The ground beneath their feet began cracking apart, black tendrils rising from the cracks. Ethan gritted his teeth. Okay, that's definitely not normal. Nyx's expression was serious. He's summoning the remnants. Ethan blinked. The what now? Before she could answer, shadows erupted from the ground, taking shape. Twisted, hollow creatures with glowing red eyes. Ethan exhaled. Oh, those. Yeah, they look bad. Vakar laughed darkly. You don't understand, human. This fight was never fair. Nyx's voice was low. We have to end this. Now. Ethan glanced at her. Any brilliant ideas? Nyx clenched her fists. 1. The ultimate sacrifice. Nyx took a deep breath. Then, she stepped forward. Ethan reached out. Whoa, what are you doing? Nyx didn't stop. She met Vakar's gaze and spoke in the old tongue of the Bloodlords. Vakar's smirk vanished. His eyes widened. No, you wouldn't dare. Nyx raised her hands, crimson energy erupting from her body. Ethan felt it instantly. A pulse of raw power, stronger than anything she had ever shown before. The temple trembled. Vakar staggered back. Ethan's throat went dry. Nyx, what are you doing? She turned to him, eyes glowing like burning stars. The only thing that can kill him. The air around them collapsed inward, pulling everything toward Nyx. Her power wasn't just growing, it was consuming. Ethan's heart pounded. He recognized what was happening. He had seen it before. She was burning herself away. "No," he snapped. "You're not doing this." She gave him a small, sad smile. "It's the only way." Ethan shook his head. "No, we find another way. You don't have to die." Nyx reached out, pressing a hand to his chest. Ethan felt something rush into him, a part of her energy, a part of her essence. So he would remember her. Then, before he could stop her, she turned back to Vakar and unleashed everything. A blinding explosion of crimson light erupted from her body. Vakar screamed. The temple shattered. The ground beneath them collapsed. And then, silence. The aftermath. Ethan coughed, dust filling his lungs. He pushed himself up, pain burning through every muscle in his body. The temple was gone. The ruins had collapsed into themselves, leaving nothing but rubble and silence. Nyx was nowhere to be seen. Ethan's chest tightened. "Nyx." A weak voice called out. He turned, eyes widening as he saw a figure crawling from the debris. Not Nyx. Vakar, barely alive, his armor shattered, his body broken. Ethan's expression darkened. Slowly, he walked over, blaster raised. Vakar laughed weakly. "She's gone, human." Ethan stared at him. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. A single plasma bolt ended it. Vakar collapsed, his body turning to ash. Ethan stood there for a long time. Then he whispered, "I hope you're wrong." He turned away, looking up at the sky. And for the first time, he felt something strange. Something familiar. A heartbeat. Not his own. A small smile crossed his lips. Maybe she wasn't gone after all.